The first scream didn't come from me, it came from my son. "Mom," he whispered, his little hand trembling as he pointed across the airplane aisle, "that's Dad." My blood turned to ice. Because the man he was pointing at, the one laughing with a woman and a baby in his arms, was supposed to be dead. 3 years ago, I buried my husband. Or at least, I thought I did. My name's Elena Carter, and up until that moment, I believed I'd finally started to heal. 3 years of sleepless nights, therapy sessions, and forcing myself to smile for my son, Jamie, who was just 2 when his father died. We were flying from Seattle to Chicago to visit my parents. A simple trip. A normal trip. Until Jamie saw him. The man across the aisle had the same sandy blonde hair, the same dimple on his right cheek, and the same habit of tilting his head when he smiled. My husband, Mark Carter, the love of my life, the father of my child, the man who died in a car crash on Highway 47. I told myself it couldn't be. My mind was playing tricks. Grief hallucinations, maybe. I'd had those before, in the early months. But then he laughed and my entire body went numb. That laugh. I'd know it anywhere. I couldn't breathe. For 3 years, I'd built my life around loss, around learning to live without him. I'd moved into a smaller home, gone back to work, tried to be both mom and dad to Jamie. But here he was, sitting in first class, alive, wearing a crisp white shirt and a smile that had once been mine. And he wasn't alone. The woman beside him, dark-haired, elegant, maybe late 20s, was holding his hand. And the baby in her lap couldn't have been older than 1. The flight attendant walked by, and I forced myself to look away, gripping the armrest so tightly my nails dug into the leather. My chest was heaving, my pulse thundering. It couldn't be him. It shouldn't be him. But my son's voice echoed again. "Mom, that's Daddy." I turned back, carefully this time. He looked different, tanner, maybe leaner, but those were his eyes. Mark's. 1,000 images flashed through my mind: our wedding day, his promises, his funeral. His funeral. No open casket. The police said the car had exploded after skidding off the road. They said his body was too burned to identify. I didn't question it. Why would I? They found his ring near the wreckage, his wallet. I remember collapsing in the morgue, clutching that wallet, begging for it to be a mistake. And now I was staring at that same man, breathing, smiling, living as if none of it ever happened. The flight felt endless. Jamie eventually fell asleep on my lap, but I couldn't close my eyes. My mind kept circling back to one thought. Why? Why fake his death? Why leave us? Who was that woman and whose baby was that? Every nerve in my body screamed to march down the aisle, confront him, demand answers. But I didn't. Because something in me, some instinct deeper than rage, told me to wait. I watched him instead. Observed every small detail. The way he leaned protectively toward the woman. The way his hand brushed the baby's tiny fingers. And the way his phone screen lit up with a contact name I caught for a split second. Renee, my everything. Renee. Not Elena. My hands went cold. 3 years of pain, grief, and raising our son alone, and he'd been out there, alive, playing house with someone else. I bit down the scream clawing its way up my throat. Because this wasn't just betrayal. It was a lie so monstrous it made me question my entire past. The captain's voice finally announced our descent. As we began landing, I felt Mark's gaze flick toward me for a heartbeat, then quickly away. His eyes widened, like he'd seen a ghost. For the briefest second, our eyes locked. And that's when I knew he recognized me. He turned pale, fumbled with his seatbelt, whispered something to the woman beside him, and didn't look back. When the plane touched down, he got off in a rush, almost running. By the time I made it through the gate, he was gone. I stood there in the terminal, heart pounding, my son tugging my sleeve. "Mom," Jamie asked softly, "why didn't Daddy say hi?" I forced a smile I didn't feel. Because maybe Daddy doesn't know we saw him. But inside, a storm was brewing. Because I wasn't going to let him disappear again. Not this time. Not after everything. And as I watched that stranger's name Renee replay in my mind, one thing became crystal clear. If Mark thought he could fake his death, start a new life, and walk away from the mess he left behind, he was about to learn that some ghosts don't stay buried. When I got off that plane, I wasn't just a grieving widow anymore. I was a woman holding on to a terrifying possibility, that the man I buried 3 years ago, my husband, Mark, was alive. 4 days after the flight, I tried convincing myself it was impossible. That I'd seen a look-alike. That grief had tricked my mind again. But deep down, I knew. It wasn't a ghost. It was him. And the more I replayed the past in my mind, the more cracks I started to see, cracks I'd ignored back then. Red flags that now screamed lies. It started small, years before his death. Mark was the kind of man who could charm anyone, a software engineer with a grin that made people trust him instantly. When we met, I was still finishing my degree in graphic design, working part-time at a coffee shop. He'd always tell me, "Don't worry, Ellie. One day, I'll give you the life you deserve." And for a while, he did. We bought a modest home in the suburbs, had Jamie, and things felt perfect. But about a year before the accident, something in him started to change. He became distant. He'd work late nights, claim he was under pressure from his boss, and come home smelling faintly of expensive perfume that definitely wasn't mine. When I asked about it, he'd laugh and say, "You're imagining things again, Ellie. Maybe it's from someone at the office." And I believed him because I wanted to. Then came the secret calls. He'd step out onto the porch or into his car, whispering. When I'd ask who it was, he'd shrug. "Just a client. Confidential stuff." But one night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to an unfamiliar ringtone. His phone lit up beside him, an unsaved number flashing across the screen. I hesitated before answering. A woman's voice whispered on the other end, "I miss you. Can't sleep without you." My stomach dropped. Before I could speak, Mark snatched the phone from my hand, hung up, and glared. "Jesus, Elena. Don't you trust me at all?" I remember sitting there, stunned, humiliated, heart pounding. "Then who was that?" He didn't answer. Just turned away, muttering about crazy paranoia and jealous nonsense. By morning, he was the sweet husband again, making pancakes, kissing my forehead, telling me I overthink everything. That was Mark's gift. He could twist reality until you doubted your own memories. Then the money problems started. Credit card bills I didn't recognize. Withdrawals I hadn't made. When I confronted him, he told me not to worry. "I'm moving some money into a side project, something big." He'd promised it would secure our future. But the project never existed. A few months later, his behavior turned stranger. He became obsessed with life insurance policies, pushing me to sign forms I barely understood. When I hesitated, he'd say, "It's just in case something happens. You and Jamie will be safe." At the time, I thought it was love. Now, sitting in my small kitchen years later, I realized how stupidly blind I'd been. After seeing him on that flight, I started digging. I pulled out old tax records, bank statements, anything that might explain where the money went before he died. That's when I saw it, a wire transfer, dated just a week before the supposed crash. $85,000, sent to an account in another name. The recipient? R. Holt. Renee. It had to be her. The realization hit me like a train. He hadn't just run away, he'd funded his escape. But even with proof, I couldn't tell anyone. How could I? "Hi, I saw my dead husband on a plane, and now I think he faked his death?" People already treated me like a fragile widow. My parents would think I was breaking again. So, I kept it to myself. For 2 weeks, I couldn't eat properly. Every sound made me jump. Every memory of him, his voice, his touch felt like poison seeping through my veins. Jamie noticed. "Mommy, are you mad at Daddy?" he asked one night, clutching his teddy bear. I forced a smile, my throat tight. "No, sweetheart. Mommy's just tired." But I wasn't tired. I was unraveling. Because if Mark had truly faked his death, that meant every tear I'd shed at his funeral was for nothing. Then, one evening, something strange happened. I got a call from an unknown number. At first, I thought it might be a telemarketer. But when I answered, the line was silent except for faint breathing. "Hello?" I said. The line went dead. A minute later, a text came through. "Stop digging, Elena." My blood froze. No name. No number. Just those 3 words. I stood there in my kitchen, phone trembling in my hand, realizing this went deeper than I thought. Mark wasn't just gone, he was hiding something dangerous. That night, I sat by Jamie's bed, brushing his hair as he slept. The world felt smaller, darker. My hands shook, not from fear but from rage. Because now I understood something. If Mark was alive, then someone else helped him disappear. And whoever sent that message, they knew I was getting close. The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't just going to find Mark. I was going to uncover everything he'd buried. Even if it destroyed me first. For 3 years, I'd lived in the shadow of grief mourning a man who, I now knew, had never actually died. But what I didn't know yet was why he did it. That answer came slowly, piece by piece, like shards of glass cutting through the fog of lies. And when I finally saw the full picture, it didn't just break my heart. It shattered everything I believed about love, loyalty, and family. After that anonymous message stopped digging, Elena. I stopped sleeping altogether. I started spending my nights at the dining table, surrounded by old boxes of Mark's files, trying to make sense of his last few months before the accident. There was one folder I hadn't looked at before, his company's paperwork. Mark had worked for a cybersecurity firm called Halston Dynamics, a mid-sized tech company known for developing encryption systems for banks and government contractors. He used to tell me he was just an analyst. But when I went through his old laptop, one I'd kept in a box since his death, I found encrypted folders, strange email chains, and financial records that didn't make sense. I almost gave up trying to decode them, until I realized he'd used Jamie's birthday as the password. Inside, there were files with titles like Project Aurora and Client Transfer Confidential. And one folder, buried deep within the others, was labeled simply, Exit Plan. The folder contained scanned documents, contracts, ID copies, and a fake death certificate. His death certificate. The same one the police had shown me. Except this version was dated 2 weeks earlier. Meaning he'd forged it himself before the accident even happened. My hands trembled as I scrolled through. The next document was a bank transfer, $500,000, redirected from Halston Dynamics client account to a shell company under the name Holt Technologies. Holt. Renee Holt. That wasn't just his mistress. That was his partner in crime. Mark hadn't died. He'd staged his death to steal company funds, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and run away with another woman. I remember sitting there, staring at the computer screen, my whole body shaking. My vision blurred, my breath came out ragged. He didn't just betray me as a husband. He betrayed everything. The late nights. The secret calls. The life insurance. It was all part of a plan to make me believe he was dead so he could disappear cleanly. I thought of Jamie, how I'd told him stories about his father being a hero, how we'd lit candles every year on the anniversary of his death. And all that time, Mark was out there, building a new life with stolen money. The next morning, I went to Halston Dynamics. I told the receptionist I was Mark's widow and that I needed to speak with someone about his case. After some hesitation, they brought me to a man named Eric Vaughn, Mark's former supervisor. When I explained what I'd found, Eric's face drained of color. He shut his office door and spoke in a low voice. Elena, we suspected something before the accident. Funds went missing from a project Mark was managing. But then, after the crash, everything froze. We assumed he died, and without evidence, the company couldn't pursue it further. I swallowed hard. You're saying, he embezzled money? Eric hesitated, then nodded. We didn't want to believe it. Mark was smart, charming. Everyone liked him. But now that you're telling me this, he sighed. It makes sense. My throat tightened. And the company never told me. He looked at me sadly. We thought you'd been through enough. I left the building numb, clutching the small USB drive Eric had given me copies of Mark's project files. Each step felt heavier than the last. That night, I plugged in the drive. Among the files was a single video recording timestamped 3 days before his death. I pressed play. Mark's face appeared on screen. Calm. Smiling. Speaking directly to the camera. If you're watching this, it means everything went as planned. By now, Elena will have moved on. Jamie will be safe. Renee, this is the start of our real life. No more lies. My stomach turned. He wasn't just escaping his job or debts. He was erasing us. I slammed my laptop shut and screamed until my throat burned. The rage came first. Then disbelief. I wanted to drive to the nearest police station, hand them everything, and demand justice. But I also knew Mark had planned this for years. He'd covered every track, paid every bribe, faked every paper. And the worst part? The authorities had already closed his case. They wouldn't believe me not without seeing him alive. But I had seen him. On that flight. With her. With their baby. That was my proof. Now, I just needed to find him again. For 3 nights straight, I barely slept. Everywhere I looked, I saw his ghost at the grocery store, in traffic, in dreams. My mind kept replaying Jamie's voice on the plane, "Mom, that's Dad." And each time I heard it, it reignited the fire inside me. He thought he'd buried his past, buried us. But he didn't count on his son recognizing him. He didn't count on me remembering every red flag. And he sure as hell didn't count on the woman he abandoned becoming the one person who could destroy his perfect new life. Because now, I wasn't grieving anymore. I was hunting. And when I find him, he'll wish he'd stayed dead. 4 days after discovering the truth, I felt hollow, like my heart had been scooped out and replaced with air. Everything I thought I knew about my life had collapsed. My marriage, my memories, even the grief I had carried for 3 years, it was all built on lies. But pain has a strange way of hardening you. And as much as it broke me, something inside me began to shift. The tears that once came so easily turned to fire. Because now I wasn't mourning a dead husband. I was preparing to expose a living fraud. It started the morning I found Jamie sitting on the kitchen floor, playing with his toy plane. He looked up at me and said, "Mommy, when can Daddy come home?" I froze. He hadn't said that in years. When I didn't answer, he frowned and added softly, "He didn't say goodbye." Something inside me snapped. I crouched down, cupping his small face in my trembling hands. "Daddy made a mistake, sweetheart," I whispered. "But Mommy's going to fix it." In that moment, I realized something I hadn't before: I couldn't afford to be broken anymore. Not for myself, and not for my son. Grief had made me quiet. But this betrayal made me dangerous. I started with what I had: the USB from Mark's company, the fake death certificate, and the name Renee Holt. If Mark thought I'd stay silent, he'd forgotten who I was before he turned me into a grieving widow. I wasn't always fragile. Before Jamie, before Mark's manipulation, I'd been sharp, ambitious, and fiercely independent. And now, those parts of me, the ones Mark had slowly buried with his gaslighting, were clawing their way back to the surface. So, I took a deep breath, brewed a pot of coffee, and opened my laptop. The first step was finding them. I spent nights combing through social media, real estate listings, corporate registries, anything that connected the name Renee Holt to the tech industry or Mark's alias. Finally, I found it. A glossy website for a new software startup in Denver called Holt Technologies. Its founder? Renee Holt. Its co-founder and lead engineer? A man named Michael Harris. My pulse pounded as I stared at the photo on the About page. It was Mark. Different name. Different haircut. Same face. They'd taken everything: his career, his skills, his stolen money, and built a new empire. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at that photo. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was clarity. Every ounce of pain I'd felt, the nights of crying, the years of pretending I was okay, all of it condensed into one burning purpose. He stole my life, my peace, my child's father, and thought I'd stay buried in the ashes he left behind. He was wrong. That night, I opened a new notebook and wrote 3 words on the first page. Find. Expose. Destroy. But first, I needed help. I reached out to an old college friend, Lydia Chen, who worked as an investigative journalist. She'd covered financial crimes, corporate fraud stories that ruined reputations and brought hidden truths to light. When I told her what I'd discovered, she didn't look at me like I was crazy. Instead, she leaned forward, eyes sharp with curiosity. "Elena," she said slowly, "if what you're saying is true, this isn't just a domestic betrayal. It's corporate theft, insurance fraud, and identity manipulation. That's a felony list." I nodded, sliding the USB toward her. "Then let's make sure he pays for every one of them." The next few days blurred into sleepless nights and adrenaline-fueled mornings. Lydia helped me gather evidence: financial links, corporate filings, fake IDs, everything. She connected me with a private investigator who traced the fake accounts and confirmed what I already suspected. Mark hadn't just disappeared. He'd made sure I'd never find him by erasing me from his past. He'd closed joint accounts, transferred assets, even rerouted Jamie's college fund into one of his shell companies. The realization nearly crushed me. But then something inside me solidified. He could take my money, my trust, even my name, but not my voice. One evening, while sorting through Lydia's printed reports, I found something that stopped me cold. A digital invoice dated just 2 weeks ago. Mark's company had received a $1.2 million investment from a venture fund. It listed him, under his fake name, as CEO. He wasn't just living freely. He was thriving. My hands clenched around the papers until they crumpled. The man who left me broken was now standing on stages, selling his story as a visionary founder. He'd replaced me, replaced Jamie, replaced our entire life, and rewritten himself as a success story. That was the moment my pain transformed completely. No more tears. No more shaking. No more waiting for karma. Because karma was too slow. I'd deliver justice myself. That night, I stood in front of the mirror, studying the woman staring back. For the first time in years, I saw strength instead of sorrow. Not the widow who lost her husband, but the survivor who was about to expose the man who tried to erase her. I whispered to my reflection, "You're done grieving. Now you fight." I didn't know exactly how I'd bring him down yet. But one thing was certain: Mark Carter, or Michael Harris, or whatever name he was hiding behind, was about to meet the woman he underestimated. And this time, I wasn't going to lose. When anger becomes a plan, it stops being chaos and starts being dangerous. I sat at my kitchen table with Lydia, the private investigator, an ex-cop named Marcus, and 2 stacks of printed files that smelled faintly of toner and exposure. On the table, bank transfers, shell company registrations, the fake death certificate, the video file of Mark's smug "if you're watching this" confession. We had motive, means, and proof. What we didn't have was the one thing Mark relied on most: other people's disbelief. He'd built layers, fake IDs, lawyers who turned a blind eye, investors dazzled by his charisma. He'd convinced the world he was Michael Harris, visionary CEO. We needed to peel those layers off, one by one, in a way that would make rational people stop, read, and act. Lydia tapped a pen against the paper. "We hit him where he's vulnerable: the money trail, the investor contracts, and public reputation. He needs a scandal that investors can't ignore." Marcus nodded. "And we make it impossible for him to claim persecution. Everything must be documentary. Papers, timestamps, witness testimony. So we made a list. A plan with teeth. Secure the financial paper trail." Marcus dug into bank ledgers he'd flagged. We traced Holt Technologies' accounts back to shell companies registered through a small firm in Nevada. The PI arranged subpoenas through a sympathetic prosecutor friend and collected bank statements showing the $500,000 diversion from Halston Dynamics, plus subsequent transfers to Holt accounts. Every transfer was a breadcrumb connecting Mark to the theft. Corroborate the fake death. Lydia contacted an independent forensic document examiner. The examiner found anomalies: mismatched ink on the death certificate, watermarks inconsistent with the issuing authority, and a signature that didn't match the clerk's. Layered with the timeline that showed the certificate predated the accident, the document turned from a sad formality into a smoking gun. Expose Renee's role. We needed someone on the inside of Holt Technologies to talk. That's where my sleepless nights paid off. I'd been quietly messaging a former junior developer at Holt who'd been let go 6 months earlier. He'd been bitter enough to meet Lydia in a diner. Over coffee, he confirmed that Renee handled client relations while Michael handled the books. He handed over Slack logs showing private channels where money movements were discussed and orders issued to obscure transactions. He didn't know Mark's real name, but he knew the code names they used. Create a public hook. Investors hate uncertainty. We prepared a press packet carefully redacted, legally vetted by the prosecutor's office, detailing the embezzlement, the fake death, and transfers into Holt accounts. Lydia reached out to a business reporter she trusted and arranged an embargoed story. The idea was to time the release so the market would have no time to spin it into rumor, just facts, damning and boxed. Set the trap, make him react. This was the part that felt almost cruel and necessary. We needed Mark to act impulsively and leave traces. Marcus arranged for a fake angel investor to contact Holt with an offer, one that required him to provide a portfolio and a notarized ID for KYC, know your customer, purposes. If Mark used any of his forged IDs or the shell company documents in response, the forensic signatures would tie him to the identity he'd tried to bury. Marcus could wire-trap the email chain and save every click. Protect Jamie and me. I hired a small security detail on Marcus' recommendation and changed all the passwords, bank alerts, and accounts to personal devices only Lydia knew about. We also prepared an emergency file for Jamie, his real birth certificate, photos, and a notarized affidavit that proved paternity, should custody be questioned in the future. If Mark played the "I'm the father" card publicly, we'd be ready. The plan read clean on paper. But execution is always messy, especially when the man you want to bring down is used to being 2 steps ahead. For 2 weeks, Mark continued to strut through investor panels and podcasts as Michael Harris, untouchable, charismatic. Whole Technologies announced a product demo that sent their valuation up another notch. He posted a picture of himself smiling with a gold watch and a baby in his arms, calling it family. Investors liked family stories. He still felt in control. We baited the email trap. Marcus, posing as a small, eager investor, sent a carefully worded message requesting portfolio documents and ID verification. Michael's replies were fast, professional, the kind that came from someone used to managing crises. He sent a scanned driver's license, Michael Harris, and a notarized LLC agreement for Whole Technologies. Marcus saved every header, every metadata timestamp. And then came the night the embargo broke. Lydia's phone buzzed in the newsroom at 5:42 a.m. She breathed once, then started forwarding files. The business journalist posted the story with the headline Lydia had worked months to craft, top tech founder linked to $1.2 million embezzlement, fake death documents surface. The piece hit LinkedIn, Twitter, and the incubator channels all at once. Investors sent panicked messages. Holt stock, thin as it was, took a hit. Conference organizers postponed his keynote. Suddenly, the world that had applauded him wanted answers. Mark's first reaction was to deny. A PR statement. A lawyer's letter. But within 24 hours, more evidence surfaced: documents we'd quietly ceded to a second reporter, bank account flags from Marcus contacts, and the former developer's Slack logs, each piece tightening the rope. He still had power, lawyers, cash, a polished defense. But now the pressure came from all directions: regulators, press, and the investors who smelled blood. And every time he tried to smother the flames, another ember flickered into public view. I watched him on television that night, his face pale, his voice measured but brittle. He said, "I have done nothing illegal." My jaw clenched. I knew the truth, and so did the world, at least enough of it to begin unraveling him. As the night closed in, Lydia placed a hand on my shoulder. "We've started the avalanche," she said quietly. "Now we watch who digs." Inside me, a new hunger rose, one that wasn't about revenge for revenge's sake but about reclaiming a life stolen from me. Mark's control was slipping, but the fight wasn't over. It was only getting louder. And somewhere, out there, he was no longer just Michael or Mark. He was a man who had to decide whether to run again or to stand and face what he had done. The morning the world closed in on Mark felt like watching a slow, dreadful sunrise, everything brightening until there was nowhere left to hide. By dawn, the SEC and a federal prosecutor had opened investigations. Marcus's subpoenas and Lydia's stories had done what we'd planned. Investors panicked, Whole Technologies board convened emergency meetings, and the incubator that had once celebrated Michael Harris asked for audits. We'd baited him, now the trap was being sprung by people with badges and subpoenas. The PR statements and lawyers weren't enough. Elena arrived at the tech conference where Mark was scheduled to speak an hour before his keynote. The hall buzzed with influencers, venture capitalists, and a live feed that would carry his face to thousands. She felt the familiar tremor in her hands, but this time it was steadier, like the hands of someone who knew the weight of what she was holding. Backstage, Mark paced. His smile on camera yesterday had been performance. Now his jaw throbbed, and his eyes were rimmed with red. Renee hovered nearby, bright and furious, clutching a stack of talking points. He kept glancing at his phone, dozens of texts begging him to postpone, promises of legal maneuvers, offers to smear the accusers. He was trying to assemble a defense out of smoke. At 10:15 a.m., the moderator introduced him. The lights dimmed, the spotlight found Mark. The camera closed in for the live stream. He took the stage, head high, and smiled that practiced smile. "I'm here to talk about vision," he began, voice calm, polished. "About transparency and leadership." The audience applauded. Elena watched from a side corridor, the press packets Lydia had prepared feeling heavy in her bag. Halfway through his spiel, a hush rippled at the edge of the crowd. Phones were lifted. A murmured question, is that her? Marcus had edged close, leaning into a press pauline and pressing a small SD card into the hand of the show's AV tech. Lydia had emailed the producer the press packet with an urgent subject, legal documentation for public release. Within minutes, the live stream feed flickered. On the big screen behind Mark, the conference logo was replaced by a video one Marcus had set to play the moment the AV tech hit play. It was grainy at first, a home camera clip of Mark, weeks before his accident, talking to the camera. He smiled into it, the same smug face from the USB confession. Then cut to bank statements, stamped documents, the fake death certificate with highlighted anomalies. The screen rolled through wire transfers, Slack logs, and Renee's name beside ledger entries. The room went silent. Mark's face drained of blood. He stumbled through a practiced denial, then faltered as whispers swelled into full-voiced questions. A reporter shouted, "Is this true?" A woman in the front row stood, phone raised. "Explain the fake death certificate." Renee's composure cracked. She grabbed the mic, voice sharp. "This is slander. We have legal counsel," but the producer was already patching in a live interview with Lydia, who sat on a sudden press panel that materialized by the stage. Lydia's face on the screen was stone cold. "Elena Carter contacted us," Lydia said plainly. "We verified the documents with independent forensics and bank confirmations. We have filed this with the federal prosecutor. These are not allegations, they are evidence." She clicked through documents on camera. The audience watched each slide, the numbers and dates aligning like teeth locking into place. Mark tried to speak, the sound system squealed and then took his mic away. Riotous questions followed. Investors rose, anger dawning. One of them stormed the stage, red-faced, demanding to know why they'd been kept in the dark. The board members huddled, whispering into phones, faces white. Outside, state investigators and local police who'd been tipped off by Marcus's contacts arrived. As Mark was escorted off stage, the cameras followed. Reporters shouted the same words Elena had wanted the whole world to know: fraud, embezzlement, fake death, kidnapped grief. The feed captured his face as agents led him down the corridor. He looked at Elena for a moment, hate, pleading, and then fear when he realized there was no runway big enough to carry him out. At the security gate, federal agents read him his rights. The words sounded unreal against the hum of the conference. Hands cuffed him while the live stream still rolled. The image of Renee, mouth pressed into a thin line, eyes glassy, stayed on screen as Mark was led away in cuffs. A chorus of camera shudders and shocked gasps filled the hall. Elena barely felt the surge of triumph that rose inside her. It wasn't cathartic, it was sharp, clean, precise like a blade. She had not come for spectacle. She'd come to reclaim her life, to call out every lie that had been pawned for comfort and ambition. Watching him taken away, she thought of Jamie's small voice on the plane and the years she'd lost to pretending. This was not just exposure. It was accountability. Outside the venue, the press mob swarmed. Reporters shoved microphones at Elena, but she only wanted Jamie. Marcus had him safe in the car, his hair mussed from sleep, eyes wide when Elena scooped him into her arms. He smelled of juice and safety. "Mommy?" he asked, sleepy and confused. Elena held him tighter than she ever had. Across the street, a man in a suit shouted into his phone, "Mark's lawyers attempting damage control." But the money was already frozen, emergency injunctions had been filed. Whole Technologies board announced an immediate executive suspension. 2 major investors pulled out. The incubator rescinded grants. Within hours, the company's valuation cratered, veering toward collapse. That night, footage of Mark in cuffs played on loop. Commentators debated whether the sentence would be severe. But Elena didn't need to watch. She was home, Jamie asleep against her chest, the weight of the day pressing into her bones. She had wanted justice and she'd taken it with a team who knew how to translate fury into law. She drifted toward sleep with a name on her lips she hadn't said aloud in years. It tasted strange and final: Mark Carter no longer invisible, no longer untouchable. Outside, the city lights blinked like a scoreboard. Justice had been served in public and loud. The man who had faked his own death and stolen their future was suddenly on display for a million strangers to see. And as Elena closed her eyes, for the first time in 3 years, she could feel peace beginning to climb like dawn over a horizon that had been dark for too long. The story didn't end the day Mark was arrested, it only began to settle into truth. For years, my life had been a series of headlines, legal calls, and endless nights of second-guessing myself. But after that conference, after watching the man who had faked his death and my grief walk away in handcuffs, something inside me unclenched. The world finally saw what I had lived through. And for the first time in 3 years, I didn't feel crazy. The trial came 6 months later. Mark was charged with identity fraud, corporate embezzlement, and obstruction of justice. The prosecutors had everything: bank records, forged IDs, emails, and the fake death certificate he'd used to vanish. He'd thought he could fake his death, take the money, and start a new life with Renee in Singapore, away from the mess he'd left behind me and Jamie, broken and bankrupt. But his arrogance had been his downfall. The courtroom was packed on the first day: reporters, investors, even ex-colleagues. And when I was called to testify, I looked him straight in the eyes. There was no hatred left, no anger, only clarity. "Why did you do it, Mark?" the prosecutor asked. He smirked, as if the question were beneath him. "Because I could. That was it. No remorse. No apology. Just ego and greed wrapped in a human shell." When the verdict was read guilty on all counts, he didn't even flinch. But I did. Not because of fear this time, but because it was finally over. He was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, with no chance of parole for 15. Renee got 5 years for conspiracy and document fraud. Whole Technologies declared bankruptcy. Every bridge they'd built on deceit turned to ash. Poetic justice, right? A year after the trial, I sat on the same flight path where it all began. Jamie was next to me, now 6, doodling on his tablet. He looked up at the clouds, smiling, free of memories he never should have carried. He asked, "Mom, is Dad still far away?" I smiled softly. "Yes, sweetheart. Very far away and right where he belongs." I'd rebuilt my life from the wreckage. The story that started as a nightmare turned into a movement. Lydia's article became one of the most read pieces of the year, and victims of financial deceit and emotional manipulation started reaching out. I started a foundation, the Phoenix Trust, to help families recover from financial and emotional abuse. People who'd lost everything found a place to start again. And Marcus? He became the foundation's lead investigator, turning every ounce of his own pain into purpose. Together, we made sure stories like mine weren't buried under silence or shame. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived. From prison. The handwriting was Mark's. "Elena," it began, "I saw your interview on TV. You looked happy. I'm glad you found peace. Maybe you'll forgive me someday." No apology. Just entitlement masquerading as closure. I folded it neatly and set it ablaze in the sink. The flames curled the paper into ash, and for the first time, I didn't tremble. He could keep his words. I had my life back. Because forgiveness isn't about freeing them, it's about freeing yourself. 6 months later, I was invited to speak at the same conference where Mark's downfall had gone viral. When I walked onto that stage, there was no fear, no ghost in the crowd, just applause. I told them my story, not as a victim but as proof that even from betrayal, something powerful can rise. And as I spoke, I could feel every woman, every man in that room holding their breath, because betrayal may break you, but justice rebuilds you stronger. When the event ended, a woman in her 30s came up to me, tears streaking her face. "My husband left me the same way," she said. "I thought I'd never recover. But your story, it made me believe I can." I hugged her and whispered, "You already are." Because sometimes, revenge isn't loud, it's simply surviving better than they ever imagined you would. Now, every time I board a flight, I glance at the clouds, remembering the day my son pointed at the man who should have stayed a ghost. It used to haunt me. Now, it reminds me of the moment truth finally took flight. Mark thought he could vanish with lies. But truth has wings too. And it always finds its way home. Speech balloon. Have you ever faced betrayal that left you questioning everything? Would you have forgiven or fought for justice like I did? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. And if this story hit you deep, don't forget to subscribe for more tales of betrayal, revenge, and poetic justice. Because sometimes, the past doesn't just haunt us. Sometimes it answers back.